relationship to the garment. Guys. Sorry, I was going to touch that. The relationship to the garments that you guys are making.
Do you want to start over?
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, because I think Aaron wanted me to send this to him once it's recorded. But essentially, Aaron and I have been coordinating on these 2 tutorial sessions. One of the most important parts of which being that we're both going to start talking a bit more about like patterns and their construction and their relationship to the garments you guys are making, as well as just kind of taking patterns more seriously in the way that we do architectural drawings. So I'll start with a little like slideshow of like references and provocations about thinking through garment patterns, and then I'll go into basically I'll rehash in a little bit more detail how you draft and assemble line work for creating patterns in Clo, and then I'll take you through a series of like 5 to 6 different techniques that you might use in the garments. They're less kind of applied, let's say, than last week, but it'll be like you'll learn how to do a dart, you'll learn how to do a pleat, you'll learn how to do all of these things that'll be useful in terms of shaping your garments into sort of 3-dimensional things. And then it's on you guys in a way to kind of take all of those things together and synthesize and use them in a project. And then, like Adam said, I'll just show some fun fashion and like inflatables oriented work that I've been working on if we have time. But I will get started with that slideshow. Share screen. And so, as I was saying, essentially, we both want to begin to invite you to begin thinking of patterns as kind of architectural drawings and take them just as seriously as you do, you know, a typical architectural drawing set, and begin to mine them for their representational, graphic, spatial, etc. potentials. I think these 2 images here are helpful in helping us come to terms with like the similarities between garment patterns and architectural drawings, not only just for like the literal parallel in terms of like the materials and methods of their construction, like here, you know, a literal blueprint, but also for like the legibility of what the final project. Oh, Adam.
Ian,
yeah,
you're showing us a document that says notes.
Oh, that's not the right one. That's embarrassing.
I mean, it's fine.
Is it images now?
Yeah. Okay. Now we're seeing a blueprint.
Okay, that's much better. Let's see my notes.
Thanks.
These 2 drawings are helpful in terms of us getting us towards that, you know, in terms of them sharing literal techniques with architectural drafting, but also them being very legible in terms of what the end garment is going to look like. So in both cases, they're trousers, but then also just as there are in architectural representation, a series of conventions from like dimension strings and keys and all of these sorts of things, so too are there in pattern making. So here you'll even see like descriptive geometry in a way of like the circle that's creating the radius on part of the trouser, but also the way in which multiple sizes oftentimes are built into a single garment, and ideas about kind of flexibility, as well as like seam allowances, which is the analog of like tolerance in fashion as it relates to architecture. But all that is to say, like, they aren't always extremely legible. Like, I think this drawing is a good analog for maybe like a early Libeskind drawing in terms of the density of its information, but also its sort of frantic illegibility. And this is from an Edwardian pattern book where they would overlay, you know, like 60 different patterns on one sheet. So an idea about maybe simultaneity or the thing being able to be a bunch of different things in the future. And then I think it's important to think of garment patterns not simply as a kind of documentation of something 3-dimensional or guidelines for getting there, but also a kind of graphic surface in its own right. And you kind of are broken or have different continuities as the thing is kind of cut up and folded into an artifact. And so here an artist is doing precisely that, overlaying a kind of new pattern and graphic surface on top of existing garment patterns. And like, also not to say that we should leave architectural representation behind by any means, just because we're dealing with things that are soft and oriented to the body. So these two images are from the modern architect Bernard Rudolphsky's exhibition at MoMA in the 40s called Art Clothes Modern. And here on the left, he's using sort of a normative typical architectural convention of like a plan cut that here of a human being, and is kind of associating, you know, an overcoat with intestines and seeing the layers of garments that surround us as being an extension of sort of our internal organs, which I think is maybe a useful way of thinking about some of the things that might be being played around with in this class. And then on the right, a sort of normative diagram, again, calling out like the number of buttons that are, and as well as pockets that men have on their suits, which in his mind, he was trying to use this to create an argument that actually, you know, the suit and garments at the time weren't modern because there was a kind of glut of content in them. He used this diagram to argue that actually we should dress more in togas if we're actual like good modernist minimalists of the 20th century, precisely for the reason that it uses less material and it rejects the kind of structure and interlining and canvassing that are inherent in suits that go against the kind of softness of textiles at large. And I think Aaron will be talking about this a little bit more next week, but, you know, in the same way that your garments are enveloping specific ready-made objects, the garments themselves might also be comprised of like found and specific materials. Patterns don't have to be sort of like drafted tabula rasa on like a flat, you know, piece of fabric that's cut up into something else. And there's a lot of potential in using very, very specific upcycled materials and constructing them and mining their potentials. So I think Aaron will talk about that a little more. This is Nicole McLaughlin. I'm sure probably at least half of you follow her on Instagram and have seen a lot of this content before. But is also a way of entering into ideas about like ecology and labor. And it's also probably productive and worth thinking about the pattern's relationship to the thing that it becomes in three-dimensional space, not just as a kind of drawing and then the thing itself. And so here, the subtractive cutout of the garment and the sheet that the material is cut out of is shown right next to the garment itself. Also, it's maybe worth noting that the garments here in both cases are like zip tied and tasseled and grommeted, which is maybe another method of assembly that some of you might want to take on instead of sewing. It's sort of equally fruitful. And he just an interest maybe in how like the pattern and the artifact can be in conversation with each other sort of in real space. And then finally, and weirdly, like in a kind of middle ground of these images are some of the talismans that the British menswear designer Craig Green has been playing around with. And for me, these almost sit, as I said, exactly in the middle of the cutout pattern and the assembled garment. They seem to be like halfway in a process of assembly or a process of being inflated into kind of the thing in which way they will become, which in a way is like weird, you know, if 90s decon architects were going to design a garment, it would maybe look more like this. So notions of kind of architectural style and movements can also potentially be folded into these garments and find their analog and softer material expressions, let's say. Okay, I will stop sharing. We're gonna head over to Chloe now. I sent a drive to Adam, a drive folder to Adam before class started. There are only a few files that we'll be actually using from that, but if you haven't already had the chance to download those, now would be a good time.
Do you mind dropping the link?
Sure, yeah, I'll drop it in the chat.
Yeah, that was a great introduction, and those precedents are really good too. So thank you.
I also don't know if you guys are like keeping tabs on shared references between the studio, but like in studios I've been in before and working with people, I find keeping arena channels like communally to be very productive. And I have a number on like architecture and fashion that I could share with you guys if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be great.
Drive one in.
What is an arena channel?
Oh yeah, it's like if Tumblr and Pinterest had a baby that was like for design research, and also in the way that Tumblr did for a while had like a really serious associated like culture with it. Like it's a very specific set of like design bros that use Arena, but it's a really good tool, and it's a good way of just compiling links and in internet file trees that you can share with people. I can follow up with Adam on sending some channels I have out to you guys. But,
Yeah, that would be lovely.
so hopefully the drive link worked and it was the right one. I'm gonna get close started. I might have the same issue that I had last week where my computer shuts down mid Zoom. But if that's the case, I haven't abandoned you guys. I'll be back in a few minutes. So I guess just hang tight. Okay. All right, let me share the correct screen this time. And also just like last time, there's a Google Doc to follow along with as I go through. Feel free to comment in the doc or interrupt the presentation. Any questions? But essentially what I'm going to be starting with is just a slightly deeper dive into like the drafting toolkit of Clo than we did last time. So again, the way in which the interface is split up is you have the 3D stuff on the left, the 2D stuff on the right, and then this is your sort of toolkit dialog box for the 2D stuff over here. I'm going to go through again like the different shape tools and how you can offset geometries and create seam allowances and these sorts of things. So in Clo, as I said before, it's really annoying. In order to get options from a button, you have to click and hold to get it. It's not right click, it's not control click, you have to hold and click. And so this button allows you to access polygon, rectangle, ellipse, spiral, etc. And I'm just gonna do a random polygon right now. And also it's worth noting that the way the polygon tool works here is really similar to Illustrator, where if you just click, it hits a point, but if you click and then drag, it uses that as a point to create a curve from. So I'm going to end up with a pretty random shape, but once you've drafted an actual geometry, you'll see it in your 3D viewport, and then you can use the tool at the very top to transform and scale it in a number of different directions, rotate, etc. The edit pattern tool, which is the second one down, allows you to move control points as well as if you hold and click it to do a number of other operations that are sort of less essential right now. But so if you're in edit pattern and you select your object, you can right click and get a number of different options as well. Oh, sorry. There we go. Yeah, you have to click on the actual object itself. So last time I think we got hung up on copying the symmetric pattern with sewing. Basically what that does, as I said before, is it creates a sort of parametric clone of the existing geometry, such that if you scale or manipulate it in any way, all of those changes are kind of tracked onto this surface. which also will appear in your 3D viewport. This is really useful when you're trying to create like the front and back of something like a quilt, for instance, because now if I go in and do some other operations on this, it'll show up on the other one. So if I click and right click again, I can offset internal lines consistently through the whole thing. This allows us to create like seam allowances, as well as to create new kind of surfaces to sew things to. So if you want to create even more sort of internal patterning or places in which you want one piece of fabric to sew to another, you'll use the internal polygon or line tool. And here it's essentially the same drafting technique where you click and then you can click and hold to create a curve. All pretty straightforward. And there also, when you right click on this, there are a number of other options for other geometries, as well as the dart function, which we'll get to later. But basically that was just another very brief overview of how you create patterns in Flow natively, as opposed to doing it in Rhino. And then I'm going to very briefly go through the sewing tools as well. It's just 2, and then we'll get into the actual kind of techniques that we're going to explore. So it's the left column here is the drafting tools. The right column here is the sewing tools. Basically, the only 2 sewing tools you're going to really use, and this is the one we used last time, was the segment sewing tool. The segment sewing tool, you go and you hover on a line, you'll get this sort of cross reference point. You have to make sure it's in the same orientation that you want it to be when you click on the next one. Otherwise, you'll be sewing it backwards. So this is really useful for just sewing 2 things together. You can go along, etc., etc. I did it backwards. But if you want to, let's say, sew a line segment of 2 different lengths or have more control over the extents of your seam, what you'll use is the free sewing tool. So the free sewing tool, you'll click and then drag the line to the length that you want to sew it. You'll start it again at the associated point and click and drag it a different length. I was doing this kind of haphazardly, and I'm sure if I click the simulation now, we get something very bizarre. Let's just see. Yeah, but now I'll go through the actual techniques that show you how to bring intentions to this sort of kit of tools. So I'll pause the simulation. Again, you can just do it with spacebar. And I will just delete all this out. So the first thing we're going to be going through is pinning. So I'm just going to create a basic rectangle. Feel free to use other geometry. Oh, and whenever you're making a piece of geometry, just clicking introduces this dialog box that allows you to give specific dimensions for the geometry. But if you click and drag, you can set it that way as well. So I'm going to just create a rectangle. And then I'm going to go over into the 3D viewport. I'm going to hover over the select mesh brush, hold click so that I get the pin box. That'll also change the display in the viewport to see the meshes and vertices. Then you'll just click and drag to select points that you want to pin. So let's just pin the top. Great. And then we can simulate. You'll see the top is now pinned in 3-dimensional space, while the rest of it is simulated. This is really useful for a lot of different reasons. I'm going to show you a kind of intricate example of one way it might be used now. So this is one of the only times we'll import the file. We're going to import the toilet OBJ. So file, import OBJ toilet. These are just the settings from last time. Make sure it's adding. ground, etc. Okay, great. So now we have a toilet, and we are going to tie a scarf around the toilet. In most of the work I saw, I think on Mira, I don't know if anyone was really using like tassels or tying or tails or anything like this, but I think that's a pretty rich kind of vocabulary that you guys could be using. So I'm going to show you how to tie something around something else. What we'll do is we'll create a really long, skinny rectangle. A really long, skinny rectangle. That should be good. Okay, we're going to wrap it around the water tank. Drag this over, and we'll use the pin tool again here. It's still selected, and I'm going to pin the center and then the two ends. And then once I start the simulation, I can use these much the way in which you use like the pinch tool when stuff is being simulated as a kind of handle that I can then manipulate. And so what I'm going to do is tie this around the toilet. And there's a few steps, the first of which is you have to release back so it's more or less taut. Now you'll cross the two of them. But you'll notice if you were going to try to manipulate it back over itself, you will never be able to get inside that will be there because it keeps shrinking. So what you're going to do is pull these out as they were, but there's a lot of space, and we're going to pin again. So in here, we're going to select like the knuckle of where the knot is going to be on that surface and this surface, and then then we're going to actually go through. One thing you'll notice here, see, is that it's starting to clip through itself. Yep, it clipped through itself. What you remember from the last tutorial, that in order to prevent the geometry from clipping through itself, you have to increase the collision offset that it has. Back to the and you open the property editor over here, and when you have object selected, this dialog will come up, and you'll go down to additional thickness for collision. I'll put it at 10 or something. That should be enough. Okay, those are pinned. It's not going to collide through itself. Let's finish this. Maybe some of you have already tied it. I'm just slow. I think it's really exciting how much using this software in particular, as well as like a lot of physics-based simulators, is truly just like a pantomiming of the real movements that you do in space. So I can release these now. And the way in which you'll release control points, just click on it, right-click, delete, select, right-click, delete, select. And then we see. Now we see we have our knot, and we can pull it tighter, track, etc., etc. We need to get the next thing, so I'm going to release. We now have a scarf around our toilet. Okay, now I'm going to show you another use of pins. I'm going to select the it's also slightly more architectural and less. So just going to delete out all of this that I had. We're going to do create a rectangle like that, let's say. We're essentially going to be creating like a roll-up door, kind of peekaboo soft aperture that I think could also be useful for a number of your projects. So just like last time, we're going to pin the top but also the bottom. So I create a line up here, and line over here. Great. I'm going to start the simulation. And then before I get too far into it, I'm going to adjust the additional collision thickness again. This one's going to go up really high, like 30 or something. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom and we're going to go really slow with this one because actually, I'm going to decrease the size of this so that the simulation. Okay. And here's the fun part. So we're going to pull it out, flip up in a way. Almost all the way up. And then we're going to use the rotation function to like spool. And if you don't go slow, it'll probably freak out. Okay. That's pretty tough, but you can imagine this applied to one of your garments that kind of roll up the thing behind it, I think, which is kind of exciting and a kind of proto architectural move. But now we need to sort of secure it in some way, and so I'm going to create a much thinner strap that we're going to wrap around.
Ian, by the way, this is really great, and I think you're impressing the students big time. They're like the chat on Slack is blowing up right now. They're having a blast.
Put it on Zoom. Get me in this chat.
Yeah, they're saying it's dope as fuck.
Okay, sick.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. W's in the chat for sure. Okay. So we're going to use the pins again. They're like extremely useful. Oh, I should have centered that. And this is something that I could see you guys. Oh, sorry. Like using something like Velcro is a really easy attachment. And I think I mentioned earlier, like zip ties could be extremely fruitful as well. Let's see, I'm just going to click through. So. Okay, let's get this clipped. Oh, shouldn't have modeled it inside of the other fabric. Let's stop that real quick. And then again, if your gumball isn't snapping to like 90s, just hold shift. Running.
I guess I had a question about this.
Yeah.
So it seems like the fabric can be stretched like to a lot.
Yes, it can.
Is there a way to control the stretchiness?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, and we did last week too, but there are different materials that you can use in Clo that have very different physical properties, and you can control it even in terms of the direction in X and Y, or the warp and weft that it has, you know, it's stretchy or whatever. The fabric that we're using now and that is used when you just import or draft a random pattern is the default fabric, and the default fabric is really stretchy and really thin. Later on, we'll be using the leather again, like we did last week, which is a lot more rigid and a lot less stretchy. And when we use that, I can go into the dialog box again and show you where the settings are to make something more or less stretchy. And you can also use fur, which will.
That's great.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think you guys know what I'm trying to do. I'm just a bit slow at it. I'm wrapping. Oh, and I caught a different control point. I'm wrapping this around the other one to secure it. I think we need to pick up the pace a little bit for the next video because we've only gone through 2 minutes.
They should make this like VR compatible.
I think people have played around with like haptic controllers for Clo before, but yeah, for another class maybe. Okay, so now we have our drop down. I'm gonna just delete all of this out again, and we're gonna go do a speed run through the rest of the stuff. Luckily, it's a lot simpler. So again, I'm just gonna create a rectangle, but feel free to use any shape you want. Actually, whatever, I'll draw polygon. Okay. So another thing you can do that is slightly less useful than pinning, but maybe some of you will prefer it, is you can freeze an object as a way of hanging something. It's also a little nicer graphically because whenever you have something pinned, you see the red control points in your 3D viewport. But if I was to have this, right click, freeze it, and then I was going to use the sewing command to sew these two together. So these two together. There we go. Okay. So these two together and then freeze the top object. When I run the simulation. Oh, that's really slow. Okay, I need to do everything smaller on my computer. It'll just hang from that as a kind of beam. Make everything smaller. And that's also something you guys should really be paying attention to in Clo, is like the scale at which you're operating, because most of these are like pre-loaded fabrics with their own sort of qualities. They'll behave very differently when you're doing an object that's, especially something like leather, when you're doing an object that's like 6 inches versus 6 feet. It also adjusts the number of vertices you use, which you can also do manually, but which I showed last week. Okay. So, all right, we're hanging our curtain that we're now going to operate on. And so essentially I'm going to go through a series of like shaping tools, like darting, shearing, pleating. And what these allow you to do in 3-dimensional space, and Aaron will go through this a little bit more, is to kind of like eat away the amount of fabric that you're working with in order to give it shape in 3 dimensions, or to shrink, let's say, one side of the pattern's dimensions. And so one of the clearest examples of this, and actually I'm going to use a normal rectangle, is a dart. And so if you think about, like, you know, if you've ever had a pair of pants that are too big, this is how you would alter a pair of pants that is too big at the waist, is to give it a dart. And what that is you're essentially just making a V, and then you're sewing that V so that on one side the distance is shorter than it was before. Sew these together again. Great. And then in the 2D viewport, I will use this command of doing internal polylines, and I'm just going to draw a V. Double click to end it. Use the sewing the segment again. Sew those together. Boom. And you can also, if you here you get the excess fabric on one side, which is maybe nice, but you can also cut the profile of the shape of the sheet itself, but that's not. So then you can also do internal darts, which are taking away fabric and in the center of the fabric to give it structure, and you'll click and hold and press dart here. So if you think about, like, a men's suit, usually your back, the place in which your shoulder blades are is farther behind you than the small of your back. There's like a dip in your back, and so you use darts to have the fabric come in and follow the line of your back as a curve in that instance. And that's what we'll do here with the dart. So again, you can click and drag or just click it, and it creates a hole in the center of the fabric. And you can change, again, the orientation, or the size of it rather, in either dimension. And then we'll use the sewing segment tool to close that. Okay, external darts, internal darts. Now we're going to look at shearing, which is where you take a fabric which is much longer than the other sheet of fabric, and you sew them together such that you get a bunch of ruffles. Think of like Fabio romance novel shirt sleeves, where like the actual cuff is like 6 inches, but all the material going into that is like a much larger diameter.
We love that.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I thought that would be a hit. So I'm going to create a huge rectangle now, much bigger. But maybe not that big because my computer will freak out. Okay, so we can see that it's bigger than our existing rectangle. And I'm going to just move this over here so it has to do less leaping when and we will once again just use the line segment tool, connecting the longer thing to the shorter thing, run the simulation. Yeehaw, there are your curtains, there's your romance sleeve hole. You can also, this is an opportunity to play with the other sewing command, the free sewing, where let's say we want this extent on this side, but we want to sew like this whole thing over here. And you'll get a different effect. Okay, and then, okay, we're looking okay on time. The last thing I'm going to go through is, even more directly than the rest of this stuff has been, a precursor for Aaron's tutorial next week. Aaron, I think, is really interested in getting you guys practical skills and thinking about like structure in textiles and the way in which through sewing and other means like interlining or adding a number of different layers, something soft can be structural and self-supporting. And so the way in which we'll be going through doing that is through top stitching. And this is the only other time we have to load something. And we are going to load import, we're importing a PDF of a pattern that I drafted in Rhino. That wouldn't take too long to draft. Live here. Top stitching pattern. Cool. Yeah, just auto scale. Okay, so essentially what this is a pattern for is a cylinder without the base circle. And all of these lines here are top stitching, which is basically when you have, and actually you can do it on a single piece of fabric, but especially when you have 2 or more layers of fabric, you do stitches on top of that such that the entire thing behaves in a more rigid way. And they don't have to be straight. They can be patterned. They can be, you know, if I was to draw another set of lines right now, you know, it could look like that. So top stitching is also a way of like producing potentially like super graphics or like drawing on top of the thing you're sewing, which could be exciting. Also thinking back to some of the precedents I showed. But I'm going to start pantomiming how you would actually put all this together and then not finish it because it's a bit of a chore. But I will show you a file of what it looks like when it's done. And then I will also show you guys a few like native Clo representational tools like rendering and how you can export. Let's say you made a pattern fully in Clo and you didn't touch Rhino at all, but you want to get the pattern out into Rhino or into Illustrator to produce a drawing with it. I'll show you how to export from this 2D viewport to get all the line work as vectors. So you can truly move between Rhino and Clo quite fluidly, even in 2-dimensional space, which is exciting. But what you do is just lay all of these around the circle, and then you'll lay their second layer around the circle as well. And then you'll go in and you will stitch top, etc. And then also stitch this to this, this to this, this to this. And I think I have a screenshot in the Google Doc that shows actually all of the relationships that you need to associate. So it takes a little bit. I'm just going to skip ahead to the final file. Not save this, and I'm going to go to the top stitch tool. So, okay. Boom. Okay. Yeah, that's all of the things together. I've also in this file given, you can see the different color uploaded and used the leather material again. And so you go to library, double click on fabric, and you'll go down to the leather, which is right beneath the knits. You'll right click, add to workspace, and then when you have whatever textiles you want to be that material, you'll reopen the property editor, go down to fabric, and have it be the leather lambskin. And the leather lambskin again is just a lot more rigid, let's say, than the default material, so it resists buckling a bit more. So let's run the simulation, and now we see something very soft is actually supporting itself and it's become structural. And you can also play around here. I was trying to find if there's better ways to do like inner lining. Let's say you put a thicker sheet of fabric into 2 other sheets of fabric as a kind of sandwich to make it more structural. I think the best analog for that in Clo, rather than having to sew textile on textile on textile, is to just use the pressure command like we were, the pressure settings like we were last time. So increasing that just kind of stuffs it with more stuff inside. See, it becomes more rigid.
Set a question. Is there a way to put other things like inside of the space between the the two sides you're sewing together, like if you wanted to put like a stiff piece of plastic or a dowel or something.
Yeah. So the way in which you would do that would be similar to the workflow we did last week, where let's say we import, the cylinder from Rhino, and that comes in the way that everything we've uploaded comes in. And then you would, create, like I am right here with the rectangles, two sides of something to wrap it. And then you would just orient them around the cylinder such that when you started the simulation, because remember how the sewing works is the lines are kind of magnetic to each other to run the simulation, that it would be the sheath for that thing. I mean, I could do that quick if that.
I think that would be, I think that might be helpful.
Okay.
For some students who are doing some things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Also, like,
Mhm.
you like I don't want to take up too much of your time, but like it's totally fine if you go over an hour. Like, I think this is really helpful, and so like if you want to stay like longer than an hour, that's totally cool with me.
Sure. Yeah. And if there are other like questions or workflows that you guys have ideas about that, or like you're using a certain technique in physical space that you like wouldn't know how to do in flow, I'm happy to field those questions. I might not know the answer, but I can probably get it to you soon. So here I'll do an example of like how that would work out. So let's say we're doing it around a toilet, but just pretend it's, a dowel or something. Actually, I'm going to raise the toilet up so we can wrap it all sides. Okay, and like I was saying, it's really important that the the orientation of these things in 3D space is actually such that it'll cover the object once the simulation pulls everything together. Because otherwise it just won't cover your object. So I'm going to make both these a little bigger, wider too. I actually could have, this was a good opportunity to use pattern. So it looks like that'll do the job, and then you can just sew. I'll just segment. Great. Okay, and then run the simulation, spacebar, press the down arrow. It'll wrap the thing. And obviously you could leave either any of the sides open. Like if you're just doing a sheath around the dowel such that it can slide through or something. And then also, as we showed last week, you can create a vacuum in addition to pressure. So let's say the thing that we wanted to wrap, we wanted to shrink wrap. The pressure right now is 0, but let's say we do like -10. Fabric will like really suck in against that, which is actually a more difficult effect to achieve in physical space, depending on what tools you guys have access to. Yeah, that's how you would do that in a really simple way. Are there any follow-up questions on that specific thing? Or otherwise, I was going to toggle back to like how you export patterns to get them back into Illustrator, as well as how to use the native blender or the native renderer of Clone, which is actually pretty good. It is especially useful when you're working with stuff like fur.
Yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat, but I don't know if maybe we could just address those. I don't know if those will be addressed in what you're planning on talking about, or if we could just have yeah, are those questions you want to answer now, or do you want to wait?
Yes, this one that I'm highlighting, I think you can guys see, is really important. When you use pressure, it's like actually putting pressure inside of the space between the textiles. And so if every seam isn't closed off, you'll know because when you run the simulation, the garment will shoot off like a rocket because all the air is escaping from one point. So you actually have to keep it airtight and pay a lot of attention to the seams and closures that you're making, because the air will escape. Other than that, in terms of things to keep in mind for pressure, and I think I've said this before, like anything that's sort of physics simulation based like this is just going to be a lot of constantly like toggling a setting, simulating again, going back, running the setting, blah, 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 and finding the fine point for like the pressure, exact pressure setting you want is, you know, a matter of doing that as well. Yeah.
I've been using the like clone underneath tool.
Okay.
Like if I make the like one side and then do all the stitching, like the top stitching or like the puckering stitch, and then like right click clone underneath, and it'll like make that interior lining, and it seems like it automatically links them without having to like go in and do the like segment sewing them together.
I see. You're using the seam allowance. I actually might not know.
The clone underneath tool, like if you just drew this one and then right clicked clone underneath, it would give you this one, like the one below
yeah.
it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Without having to like automatically segment stitch them. It seems to link them. And like then if you made, like I was making them like inflated, like you would add positive pressure to the top one and negative to this bottom one, and they stitch and stay together.
Okay.
But I don't know if that was like not.
No, that sounds
correct,
like
but
I'm also just learning the software, so that is a hot tip.
Yeah, I did the same thing. Yeah, you just have to be careful because, like, yeah, like I think like she's saying, like you have to put like -10 pressure, I think, right on one side, and then +10 on the other piece.
Okay.
But it works really well. Yeah.
Like reciprocal. It like whatever amount of pressure you want, it just has to be even on either side, or else it gets a little funky.
I see.
But that makes it seems easier if you're drafting in Clo. If you already drafted this quickly in like another thing, then it seems like a no-brainer to just leave it. But if you're drafting in Clo without having to do it all over again, cloning it underneath automatically links them.
Any other hot tips that I fully missed? Skill sharing session.
Do you want to just like show? Do you want to try that to show the other students who don't?
Sure. So you're selecting and then clone underneath, clone layer, clone under.
Yeah, you could do the top one or the bottom one. Yeah, and then it links them together.
Okay, I see. Oh, now it's gonna screw up our, because it's part of the ones I made. I'm gonna copy that over. Have you had issues with copy pasting before? It normally lets me just copy geometry over whatever. I'll draft something.
Maybe your computer is just frying.
It doesn't like me today. Yeah, it can't handle computing that. Okay, so you would do clone over or under. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, clone under will give you like an interior lining.
I see.
And if you look closely, if you zoom in on it, there's like technically two little pieces, but they're like automatically stitched. So if you had interior like seam lines in there, then it would link them together as well.
That's great.
Then like they say when on the thing I was watching to like draft it all on the top sheet first, or the first piece of fabric, so that when you do clone it, you don't have to do anything else, because it won't work if you then draw on the cloned one.
Right, makes sense.
So.
Okay, sweet. That's a good tip. Oh, the other tool I meant to show you guys was tacking is really useful. Like when I was making the knot earlier, if there are things that you've associated with each other that you want to not come apart, but you want to do it in a kind of ad hoc way once you're in the middle of the simulation. Here, I'll show you. I'm going to time on you. Oh my God. Okay, my computer's freaking out at me a little bit. I'm going to just do this really tiny close to the origin because I think it is important to.
I guess you could delete all that other stuff, right?
All this other stuff.
Thanks for staying a little, longer than you planned on. Is when do you feel like you need to go? And I don't want to,
Yeah, what I had left was I was going to well, I'll show you guys this little tacking thing. I was going to show you how to export your pattern from the 2D window, and then also just how to render really quick, all of which
Yeah.
are really fast. And then I was going to show you some fun little inflatables I've done, but we can mix that if we're getting too deep into.
I mean, I'm fine with you like going another hour, but the thing is, I don't want to step on, your schedule for the day if that's.
I am good through the whole next hour, but I don't think I'll stay that long. But
Okay.
I do have some time.
Okay, great.
Okay, so let's say you're playing around in your workspace. You started tying all these knots. Are you, because of how the simulation's running, you just want to tack something really quick to something else? And the way in which you'll do that is you go down and use this little tack command. Super easy. You just zoom in, you find a point, you find another point, and now they're tacked together. You can just make a little. And then when you keep the simulation going, they act basically in the exact same way as the sewing command, but just like point-to-point connections. And now, even if I'll keep that one, but if I delete these pins, raise it up, these guys will stay together, which is pretty useful. Okay, so exporting and rendering. All right, let's just take what we have here. This was drafted in Rhino, so it's just a reverse import, which is kind of weird. But pretend you've drafted everything in Clo with this whole complex arrangement of patterns. Super easy. File, export, Adobe PDF, and you just give it a name. And the dialog box comes up, and you just have to pay attention in the way in which you do whenever you're moving between any software to the scale and then the kind of lines that you want to include. It probably makes sense to include all of them, but if for some reason you didn't want the outline or something, do it that way, and then it should just export and open immediately. Oh no, it didn't prompt open, but I'll open. So you could take that into Rhino Illustrator, play around with it, do fun develop surface drawings. I don't know. And then I thought it would be fun to end on rendering because it's immediately gratifying and really easy. So I'm going to just go ahead and take some of these segments and give them some other materials that are a little bit more fun. So I'm going to try to find one of the furs somewhere. Yeah, let's do fox fur. I'll add the fox fur. Okay, what else do I Sherpa something? Okay, add that. I'll add that. Great. So now in the property editor, I can, let's make that fur. Let's make this ribbed something. Let's make the top. Let's make that fur too. And why don't we make this ribbing on the outside as well? Okay, great. So now we've given it a bunch of different materials, and we will open the render window. And the render window just replaces the 2D viewport window, and you can toggle between the two down here. And just like in V-Ray, you can do an interactive render or a static render. So if you do an interactive render, it'll just live render whatever is in that viewport. Now we see our now hairy nylon leather bag. And there's like really typical lighting settings that really don't need to go through with you guys. If you want to change, like, you know, the size of the thing you're exporting, you click image video properties and open the property editor, and then you can change, you know, output size to something much larger than the standard, change the resolution, you can change the background, upload environments. But it does, because it is like proprietary to this garment design software, it is really good at rendering the kinds of things that you make in it. So for some of your guys' representations, it might not even make sense to go back into Rhino. You might just need.
Is there a way to make the seams show up in the render view?
Oh, the line work?
Yeah.
Seems here, but I don't think so. But let me change. If I change the pressure settings, there'll be more visible. But there might be. I can look into that. It would be disappointing if there weren't.
Thanks. Yeah, this is really great. I think you're showing so many like mind-blowing things to people, which is really awesome.
Okay, it should be slightly more electrical. But I can see if you can export line work from the rendered view. That'd be really good to be able to get out of this software. And then to actually render in a non-interactive way, you just start the actual render, and then it'll take however long, depending on how big you made it. And it auto saves to in your file tree to a subfolder within the Clo folder, but it prompts opening that upon finishing the render, so it's really easy to pivot to wherever you want. Yeah, is there another question?
I was gonna say that so the students are like gonna be like this next week, basically they have to like physically make some things in preparation for the review on Valentine's Day, the 14th. So I guess like in terms of the workflow, like if they've been doing, you know, they've been prototyping essentially in Clo.
Yeah.
And then they found the thing they want to make physically.
Yeah.
I guess like the workflow around that, you know, I guess it would just be like exporting your pattern.
Yep.
And just printing it out at full scale.
You go all the way back to this, right?
Yeah.
You just, and that's like how actual, pattern making paper works too, is the print is sacrificial. You print it out at full scale, you put the textile beneath it, and you cut them all as one thing. There's different ways in which you can get it. Like there are also tools that you can get that'll you run it along where you want to seam to be or something. It'll poke holes so you know to reference like, oh, this is where the seam allowance will be or whatever. I think that Aaron will get into that more. But as a first step, yeah, like you're going all the way back to the beginning in a way. You've like been designing through this digital space, and then you get the physical thing, and then you assemble it.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Okay. Any more Chloe questions that are may or may not have the answer to? Oh, and you guys saw that after it rendered, it prompted opening that file location. Sorry, who was saying something, Brian?
I was just going to say this would be a good time to ask any of your technical questions that you've been encountering problems in Clo about. Maybe brainstorm what those might be while Ian transitions to sharing some of his own work, if that's still something you want to do.
Yeah, I have time if people are still attentive.
Yeah, I want you to show it.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll stop sharing and reshare it in a second. Let me get out of Clo. Oh, I guess my video's been off for a really long time. I was making a bunch of hand movements and stuff that I thought were helpful for you guys.
Oh, it's okay. I think,
Let me see if I can put it back on. Like I said last time, I think I just have like a USB webcam that is hyper.
Yeah, it went off again. Oh, it's on again.
Oh. Okay. Anyway, all right. Well, I'll try to make hand movements. Okay, so I'm just going to show like 3 to 5-ish projects that I've done over the past few years that I think intersect in some ways in like a one-to-one way with some of the concerns of the class in terms of like fashion, bodies, aesthetics, soft bodies, specifically inflatables, etc. And I'm actually going to start by showing a project that started in the very first class session of the very first class I ever took in architecture, my first year as an undergrad, which was with this professor named Nicholas DeMoncho, who actually, like Adam, like me, like a lot of people, cares a lot about the intersection between like architecture, fashion, and identity, let's say, and what a really good book that's like a kind of material and architectural history of the spacesuit. But when I was in that class, it's kind of a survey class, you talk about like a Corb and all of these sorts of people. And so, 2 weeks into my architectural education, we just had a lecture about Corb, and then I went to a thrift store the following weekend, and I found this jacket that on the inside said something about Le Corbusier and then a bunch of other things in French. And so I had the dizzying experience of like just having learned who this person is, and then seeing something and knowing they're important, and then seeing something associated with them for $15 and a thrift store in Berkeley. And so I bought it, and then I looked into it more deeply, and it turns out in 1948, Le Corbusier commissioned this French Parisian menswear boutique, Arnie's Paris, to design and then construct like a bespoke drawing jacket for him, so that he could use at the drafting table. And the garment on the right is a reproduction of that. It was modeled 50% off of a French gameskeeper's jacket, kind of like a chore coat from a 1940s film called The Rules of the Game. And then it was The other 50% was based off of a kimono because of the extremely wide armholes allowed like free range of movement at the drafting table. And then additionally, the pitch of the armhole was rotated such that it was associated with like this orientation as a kind of default because he was supposed to be using it only at the drafting table. And I was like, wow, this is so weird and interesting. Since Corp commissioned it from them, it is entered into their like seasonal staple that they, you know, sort of offer all the time. And they've been trading on like the notoriety of Le Corbusier as the figure who designed it. But there are no photographs of Le Corbusier wearing it anywhere. The Le Corbusier archive in Paris, which he curated during his own lifetime, and it's part of the reason why we still talk about him today, is because he, you know, left his legacy for us nicely wrapped up in a bow. The only garments or anything sartorial at all that is in that archive are like 4 pairs of his identical eyeglasses. And then I was talking with Antoine Picon, who's a professor here at the GSD, who also runs the Le Corbusier Foundation. And he said, we also have, 1, I don't know anything about this jacket, but 2, we also have 2 pairs of pajamas. We don't know what to do with. So I was really interested in, let's say, the like double obscurity of the jacket, both in terms of like people not really knowing about it, but also Le Corbusier deciding that the one garment he had actually constructed for himself to do what was ostensibly the most important kind of like work of his life, you know, drafting, was totally scrubbed from his archive. And so I wrote an essay about that a few years later when I was like a junior or something. It's still on the internet. It's not very good. But all of this just to say that like from essentially almost the very first moment of my architectural education, like architecture, fashion, garments, identity were kind of welded together. And that's a fixation that has continued. And I'm grateful to Adam for letting me have some degree of access to this class where some of these subjects are coming together. And then I'm going to pan to a photo of me looking very upset, talking to Ralph Simmons and Lucia Prada on the OMA designed runway for the digital menswear fall 2021 collection in Milan, which was sort of just a bizarre opportunity, but also bizarre in terms of it being a direct kind of intersection of some of these interests coming together in the uniquely mediated situation where I'm on the runway, but not on the runway in the same way that I'm in Ann Arbor right now, but not. And we were allowed to ask questions of, this was also the first time that Rolf had done a collection as the co-creative director with Muccia for the menswear. And I asked a question that I thought was really smart, but they didn't like at all. That was basically like, you know, who is this collection for? Like, what does it mean to do menswear today in traditional fashion? We still show menswear and women's wear separate, like, and they didn't like that at all. But if, you know, 5 years from now, Prada releases a gender neutral collection, I want to see something on the back end. And then all of these things were sort of able to come together in an editorial project that was both collaborative and cross-institutional. I showed this very briefly before, but I had the opportunity to guest edit an issue of Yale Paprika's, a Yale architecture student publication, with my co-editor Angela Lufkin, as well as Paprika always partners the editors with 2 graphic designers in the Yale MFA program, and in this case it was Anna Sogstrom and Betty Wang. And we also collaborated with the creative director of Boot Boys, Kevin McCaughey. And this was a really fun opportunity to really sort of interrogate architecture's relationship to fashion on a number of different fronts. Like, part of what's I think is so interesting about the term and the culture around fashion that you guys also have to confront in this class is that it's a noun and also a verb, right? As in to fashion, which is something that you guys are confronting now in both digital and physical space. And so that immediately got us to commissioning work that investigates issues of labor and construction and fashion. So someone wrote a really powerful piece about Bangladesh sweatshops. Other people were looking at the way, let's say, garments increasingly mediate a relationship to like our climactic and also like surrounding bioenvironment, which should not be, news to anyone who is still, has to wear a mask every day. But someone had created an air filtering garment as one of their thesis projects at Princeton. And so we included that as an example of all these kind of bizarre entanglements that are in the intersection between architecture and fashion that can include from issues of labor to issues of the climate as a whole, as well as an Indigenous Canadian artist, Kawanati, who created garments for an Indigenous community in Second Life. First, that those garments were also modeled first in the digital in the way that some of these projects are in the process of being, that then she had the opportunity to make as an actual collection and was in vogue. So it's a very fun issue to work on. We were very excited about the medium of the piece speaking to its theme in a way. So it's printed, as I had mentioned before, on a alphanumeric blue grid, which is what the substrate of pattern making paper is. And then the editors, and I wish this was a bit larger, but I think I showed you last time, the editors actually hand drafted these patterns and then scanned them in before it was printed. And then a number of people have since actually assembled them into the dog-sized garments. But the direct lamination of the theme and the medium and the editorial mission was pretty exciting. And then we took it even a step further, working with Kevin McCaughey, as I mentioned, working to upcycle vintage Yale merch that we sourced from like thrift stores and Depop, and turning them into sort of special branded merch for the issue, 50% of which got the issue printed at 1-to-1 scale, sort of on the garments themselves, and the other which got hits of different sort of custom branding that we made for the issue. I have, well, maybe when I come to Michigan, I'll bring the t-shirt that I have, because it printed really, really well. And when I wear it like to lecture classes, I find myself like reading the actual issue on my t-shirt when I'm not paying attention. But this launch was really, really successful. Part of the reason is because Boot Boys is like, as I've mentioned before, is like, its stock in trade is like kind of supreme hype beasts who also care about architectural and design culture. And so it has a sort of enormous following, and all the pieces sell out, within 10 minutes of the drop. And we just listed them on eBay as a 10-day kind of auction. And I think no piece sold for under like $100. And so we raised, I think, over $2,500 for a garment workers labor organization in LA, which was also a fun, output of this project that had so many different outputs. But I'm going to change pace a little bit now from let's say fashion to soft bodies and inflatables more generally. And so this project, which I completed last summer with, again, a bunch of collaborators, Remy McLean here at the GSD, Oliver Maldo, who's in Germany at Stuttgart, and Sarah Pack, who is an electronic musician, was part of this exhibition called Architecture Fringe that happens in Edinburgh, Scotland every summer. And so the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh is an extremely long-standing festival. It's the equivalent kind of to Lollapalooza in the US. And over the past few years, they've had a kind of architecture component. And what we proposed was to do an augmented reality installation atop Colton Hill, which is this big hill sort of littered with monuments at the top and center of the city, specifically looking at addressing the history of the Scottish National Monument, which is super bizarrely an incomplete fragment of the ancient Greek Parthenon. And it started as a proposal in 1828 to essentially commemorate the fallen Scottish soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars. And they said, in order to dub at the time Edinburgh as the quote Athens of the North, they needed their own kind of Acropolis analog in Colton Hill and their own Parthenon analog and the kind of direct reproduction that they were proposing. But they ran out of money a few years later, and so it was never kind of finished. And so it has this really weird sort of ghostly history of over the past few centuries. There have been dozens and dozens of proposals by architects and members of the public alike to like finish the incomplete structure, because it's still referred to as, quote, like Edinburgh's disgrace and the pride and poverty of Scotland to this day. So it's kind of like denigrated on behalf of being a kind of a fragment or a ruin. But what we did through the medium of augmented reality was to revive and quite literally like blow up some of these proposals. So going from left to right, there was a proposal of using it as an extension of the Scottish National Gallery. And so we took busts of important figures that exist in the gallery and literally sort of blew them up and texture mapped blue and white, which have been the colors of the Scottish national flag for the last 400 years. On top of them, in the center, there was a proposal to just complete the Parthenon fragment as is. And so we kind of mirrored in both plan and section the fragment to what its extents would have been if it was completed. And then third, there was a proposal for it to be finished and built as a catacomb for various Scottish national heroes. And so what was below ground now is kind of above it, and we see all of those grave markers floating. And like the project traded quite heavily, and I'll show you new images now so you get less bored. Traded quite heavily in, let's say, like the rhetorical. So it's new as in new history. Things are blown up, things are filled with hot air, et cetera, and we felt like that was doing a lot of work in terms of making the inflatable as a medium, a vehicle of critiquing histories that we maybe have that are maybe uncomfortable and that we seek to address in some way. And so this is what it looked like sort of on site. It was like more successful than we thought, but we actually couldn't go there to experience it ourselves. So people were only able to send us screenshots. And I had my friend who lives in Scotland kind of just spend the better part of the day walking around and filming this thing for me. It worked at sort of multiple scales. You can get sort of up close to them and engage with the things that are holding the balloons down. And then there's been a follow-up afterlife to this project. And the project itself was creating a kind of temporary virtual memorial to an unfinished memorial that is itself, you know, a reproduction of another memorial somewhere else. And so we're interested in, let's say, like the recursive process of memorialization that was at stake in all of these reproductions, as well as in like the virtual medium of architecture. And so for Princeton's journal Pigeon, we created a series of these sort of AR headstones or sort of grave markers of our temporary installations that are sort of surrounded by phones, filming them, the bus that is the substrate of some of the inflatables, as well as on the bottom, a sort of spinning cadre of emojis that are the digital analog to the history of Scottish grave marker kind of inscriptions. And also I'll click now, we collaborated with electronic musician to do a sample of this really wonderful song by this post-punk British band called The Fall, called Edinburgh Man, who a lot of their lyrics, a lot of the lyrics in the song like directly map to some of the themes of the project. So like, I wish I was in Edinburgh, echoing the way in which we couldn't actually see our own installation, as well as the line, like history just repeats itself, really hitting kind of the nail on the head of what we were driving at. But it was remixed into a kind of dirge or like a funerary song to our installation. So I'll play that really quick. I don't know if you got. Okay, well, I'm gonna drink water for a second.
We're not really getting any sound.
Oh, okay. Well, at least I got a drink of water out of the pause. But
Yeah.
there's a fun dirge. It samples this song. We were excited about like let's say.
Oh, you know why?
Design,
I don't think you're sharing computer audio.
what is happening?
You're not sharing computer audio, so you'd need to like stop sharing and then check that check mark when you share again, or
Oh, I
something.
mean, I can also just move on. It's not the best song
I mean,
ever.
I want to hear it.
Okay. I'll try to figure it out. Stop share. So I go, what do I do now?
When you share a screen, when you click share screen, just choose like share computer audio.
Can you still see my video?
No.
Okay, I think my computer is about to restart.
Oh,
So
that's okay.
I will be back in a minute. Hopefully you guys are still there and want to see more.
Okay, great. We'll see you in a second, I guess. Why don't we take a, I don't know, I guess we'll just wait here. Oh yeah. Am I frozen or is it just Ian?
Just Ian.
Okay. Great. Yeah. I think that I know that we're over time, but I wanted to give Ian some more time to just share his own work and stuff, because I think it's really great and relevant to you all. So yeah, also Ian will be physically here for the project 2 review. So you'll get to meet Ian in the physical world, and you'll notice how tall he is. He's like 6'5" or something. He's very tall. Yep. So there you go. There you go. Did anyone have any questions so far about anything that's happening, about how our review is on the 14th? That's in like 10 days-ish. Okay. Ian's back. Hello.
Hey, okay. I'm back. What do
Back.
I do? Share screen.
So
Oh
when
no,
you
and I
share
already lost
screen,
video. Share sound. Okay.
yeah, that should do it.
All right. Thanks for hanging in there. I'm almost done.
Yeah, that's cool.
That's interesting. Okay, let's see if it does now. And then I think it loops. All right. All right, next slide.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're rounding the corner now, just 2 more really short projects. This is one that I just got approval to complete very recently, and I think is also maybe a lesson in like minimum viable product for getting stuff funding, because we essentially, did 3 drawings, this being one of them, and none of them are very good. But I think the idea is interesting. So I was working again with some friends, in this case, Amir Halabi, Jen Levine, and Leon Fong, who are all classmates with me here in grad school. And there is a festival that happens on Harvard's campus in the Yard every spring, called the Arts Festival. And they essentially give funding to students through competitive entry to do various installations about kind of Harvard as people are touring. And something that I have been really obsessed with for a while since undergrad is the steam tunnels beneath campuses. And Harvard has maybe the most storied and bizarre history of steam tunnels beneath campuses. So it goes back over 200 years ago to the founding of this secret society at Harvard called the MedFac, or the medical faculty, which used the steam tunnels beneath the campus to sort of slink between buildings and steal things and pull pranks. And they were extremely notorious for what they commissioned a fake degree and like gave it to Napoleon. Like they were like quite notorious pranksters, and the steam tunnels were like the vehicle for their debauchery, let's say. And even up until like the hyper securitization of college campuses, 2000 post 9/11, students were like just dipping beneath ground and using these steam tunnels as shortcuts between classes, or like hooking up with at night and doing any of number of other things. And so there's this really interesting lamination of like infrastructural and social history, and in some cases, if we're going to extend it to the MedFact, of like global geopolitical history that sees itself in these now completely invisible, totally securitized steam tunnels that are almost always underfoot when you're in Harvard Yard, which is the main sort of iconic section of the historic campus. And so our proposal was essentially, well, let's take the ground plane that separates us from these steam tunnels and treat it as a kind of mirror. And so the on average 10-foot wide diameter steam tunnels that are around 6 feet beneath the ground, let's put one 6 feet above the ground for the duration of this festival, so that people can kind of gather beneath it, and it reproduces a kind of social space that is lost to now 2 or 3 generations of students. I'll show you a really bad screenshot axonometric of what that looks like. There's a steam tunnel beneath the ground, and we are producing a kind of pneumatic steam tunnel above ground in the form of a mylar cylindrical inflatable that is suspended underneath from a series of PVC pipes that will be attached to a smoke machine, such that at special points they'll shoot out kind of a vapor that is steam's analog. So it'll be this kind of shimmering, reflective, always moving, sagging, steam surrounded, curious object in the middle of Harvard Yard, and then it's tied down or leashed down over top by rope, and then weighed down by sandbags. So it's extremely cheap. I think our budget for this thing is like $400, and it's 30 feet long. So that is also an argument for.
Are you putting helium in it, or how?
We're not putting helium in it because it's so expensive.
Yes, I was gonna say, like, that's a lot of helium.
Yes, no, it's so expensive. Yeah. So it's just air we're pumping in. We're like renting a fan. We're buying everything from Home Depot and then returning it.
That's what I do.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an argument for the cheapness and efficiency of installing things that are inflatable. And then we did, this one collage of, collapsing the historic Harvard campus with this sort of curious, reflective, steam emitting object. And somehow it convinced them to give us money, which I was really surprised by, because essentially we're saying, well, beneath our feet is a place where a lot of people used to, do drugs and have sex and get up to a lot of bad things. Let's remind everyone that those are still there. But somehow the campus was okay with that reminder. Okay, and then this is the final project, and I promise I will be out of your hair in studio for a while. But this project, in the way that maybe the first one was, is an extension and revival of some research I've been doing for a while. So undergrad, I was asked to write a paper about utopia for a seminar on utopia, and I had this guiding question of like, okay, what is the smallest unit of space that utopia can operate upon? And I decided to look at a list on Wikipedia of micronations, because I thought that might be a good place to start for something small and utopian. And I found this place called the Otherworld Kingdom, which was like a femdom micronation that existed in the rural Czech Republic in a renovated 15th century castle from the late 90s through the early mid 2000s. And it reproduced almost all the functions of a larger state. And its founding mission was like inherently expansionist. I think it was something like, and I don't have it written down, but the goal of the Otherworld Kingdom is to get as many men under the dominant rule of women as, you know, humanly possible. So that, you know, if it stuck around longer, maybe they'd be waging war with Russia right now instead of the US. But there were a number of really interesting rules in the kingdom, one of which being, you'll see on the right, a woman at the top of a black throne, that is Queen Patricia. She was the matriarch of the Otherworld Kingdom, and men were not allowed to look at her. But she basically organized and was in charge of all the activities that sort of happened within the castle on its ground. And there's like so much to get into in terms of the bylaws of the kingdom and the way in which it functioned. But I'll gloss over that a little bit to show you. It was largely proliferated or advertised through a website that, you know, it's now become basically just like a place to buy porn, but this Wayback Machine is what it looked like, you know, in 1997. To the right, this was a book that I actually have a copy of that was its founding charter, published both in German and in English in a split edition that has like its constitution. It outlines like the curriculum of the state educational facilities, et cetera. Like it goes into extreme detail to reproduce, you know, a full state apparatus, including, as you'll see here and in the previous photos, like it had its own flag, and it also, which I'm just so thrilled by, had its own currency, which was of course the dom. That came in 1 and 5 mark denominations. You can still buy these on international like currency trading websites, and I have somehow resisted in the few years that I've known about this buying one, but I do really want one. And then in 2008, the kingdom shut down. No one ever knew who funded it. There's a lot of speculation that it was ex-KGB agents actually. But there was drama with the actual physical kingdom, and it shut down. And in response to that, people in the femdom community globally, who, as you might imagine, like the Otherworld Kingdom was like truly a utopia, like a place they all knew about and talked about and wanted to visit and be citizens of. In lamenting the loss of the physical kingdom, rebuilt it digitally in Second Life, which was the first, and I would argue better, metaverse platform that came out around, I think it came out 1999 or 2000, but in 2008, a woman named, well, her full title is Reverend Sublime Goddess Thana Betty Sherry, rebuilt the kingdom in Second Life, partially through getting people in the physical kingdom as it was shutting down to like send her, you know, like dimension strings of corridors and photos and details like this so that she could construct it in Second Life. But then also had to do a number of strange like affordances to the architecture because of how, you know, video games worked at the time and still work. So in Second Life, most of the time you're in a third person view, other than like when you're really in the middle of acts and want to switch to first person. And because of that, all the ceiling heights are like 30 feet because of like how the standard camera position is in Second Life. So everything is just sort of scale 1D vertically, which I think is very funny and interesting. But anyway, sorry, I could talk about the Otherworld Kingdom for a while, but it was remade in Second Life. I find this very interesting, and through a grant from MIT, myself, Leah Wolfman, who you guys all probably know, who's the other fellow right now at Michigan, and a friend at MIT, Zach Schumacher, have applied for funding to basically do a media archaeology project of the Otherworld Kingdom in its physical and digital instantiations. And oh yeah, I've written some things about both versions of the kingdom, and this is kind of just an extension of those. In part, again, we're also returning to inflatables as a medium of producing artifacts for this installation. Not simply because every project I have to do has to have inflatables in it, but one, because they're cheap, as I've argued for before, but two, there's a really interesting like visual and material culture of inflatables like in BDSM and femdom communities. And there's also an idea about like, some of this content is not safe for work, let's say, and there's like a visual softening that happens when a pair of handcuffs is twice the size and blown up, let's say, rather than real handcuff artifacts. And so with all of this in mind, we have done a test of one way, a project that seeks to, in mixed reality, bring together, like, let's say, physical pneumatic artifacts extracted from both versions of the kingdom, as well as sort of digital content might interact and play through a kind of white cube gallery space. And Leah, I would say, is specifically interested in like the way in which furniture, and specifically this pneumatic furniture and devices, might produce very specific bodily relations to it in a kind of sub-dom axis. And I think as you guys get into the second project, like the bodily relations that you're able to have with certain kinds of furniture is a really interesting thing to consider, and the way in which it allows certain kinds of interactions with and perceptions of space. But I'm done now.
Yay. Woo! Yeah, Ian. Let's go. Get it. I wish I wish I was a citizen of the other world kingdom.
Yes.
They probably have free healthcare. I'm not gonna lie. If you are gonna be like, spanking your citizens all day, and there's going to be injuries, and you have to keep them healthy.
Yeah.
And it seems like a great place. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Is the Second Life kingdom still around?
Yeah, so that's part of the funding that we're applying for. So I'm in contact with the woman who rebuilt it in Second Life in 2008. It only lasted like 2 years or so, but she still has people sort of ready to, in exchange for like microtransactions in Linden bucks, which is the currency of Second Life, to whip up the kingdom again. So I'm hoping to siphon money from MIT towards creating a femdom utopia in Second Life. But I think Adam's healthcare and desire to live in the Otherworld Kingdom reminded me that if any of you have heard of the Otherworld Kingdom before, it was probably through TikTok, because like around 6 months ago, someone made like an info like, did you know in 1997 women ruled this kingdom in the rural Czech Republic? And then everyone reacted to it like, oh, like I'm gone. Like everyone wanted to move to it, and it sort of blew up on TikTok for a minute. But yeah, that is some work I've done. It has been great to share it with you guys, and hopefully the tutorial made sense. And please let me know if you have other questions that I can help address. But I'm really excited to see all of the work, and have really enjoyed seeing the work that I have seen so far in the mural boards. Like I've said to Adam, and probably to you guys a few times, I wish I could be in this studio. It's so exciting.
Well, you are in the studio. Look, you're here, right?
Yeah, I'm here right now.
But yeah, thank you so much. I think that a lot of the stuff you showed was inspirational, mind-blowing, ridiculous, fun in all the right ways, and also probably helpful to a lot of people, or got them thinking about stuff maybe they didn't consider before. So yeah, thank you so much, Ian. Thanks to the students for listening for 2 hours, which I know is more than you normally have to listen to something, so I appreciate that. So yeah, Ian, thank you so much. I'm gonna upload this on YouTube if you don't mind.
What was that?
I'm gonna upload this on YouTube.
Oh yeah, sounds great. And it's also nice to meet all of you guys slightly more digitally officially than the last session where I was talking to a blank screen. But looking forward to seeing you guys in person in March.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Okay. So talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so I think that was nice. Thanks for your patience. I'm gonna stop recording now. Let's